Morning, everyone. I am so glad to open up your Monday morning with Guideline 85. And before we get started on the actual presentation, I want to introduce my associates and let them chime in. Of course, we've got Lucas Evans, the Chief Behavior Analyst, joining us this morning and being part of the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here.
And we've got I believe Melantha might be on. Not sure. She may have some challenges unmuting this morning, but my other associates are the intensive systems consultants, Kay Hamblin and Rob Cowan.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And so with that, we'll kind of get started. I want to give a little bit of background. Of course, Guideline 85 comes out of the original directive of DD 4.300, and then out of the CSR 9, CSR 45-3.090. So, and the directive has been around since October of 2016, and the directive became a CSR in March of 2020. So this is kind of an extension of all of those to provide everyone support and guidance as to how the process is to work. So with that, our goal this morning is to outline the guideline to identify reporting and notification requirements, the steps in the process, that is what happens and when, what the follow-up looks like, and then actually the process of how this will fit into connection. So I'm really excited about that area also.
Rita, can I add something?
Sure, please do, Lucas.
So just for folks, so there's help if you need it. So this presentation today is not really about what is a prohibited practice and what isn't. We'll talk a little bit about that, but mostly this is just about what we do about prohibited practices when they're suspected or discovered. There is another webinar that we recently did that kind of talked about the specific kinds of prohibited practices. These are a list of strategies that have been kind of prohibited for a very long time. They're not really new. And when we send the FAQ or the follow-up document from this presentation, we'll link that previous webinar in case people want to learn more about what is and isn't a prohibited practice more in depth. And today, again, just is focusing on what we do when we find them.
Great, thanks for that clarification, Lucas. And yeah, some of the original information about the CSR is also out there from when Dr. Rogers did the original information about the CSR. So why does the guideline exist? Well, of course, it exists for consistent and systematic responses when there are prohibited procedures suspected or discovered. And, you know, this ensures the health and welfare and rights of the individual, because that's a really important part. Of course, the whole idea of prohibited practices is under that section of rights of the individual in the CSR. It also ensures the quality of life without coercion, seclusion, or other practices that infringes on people's rights. And I know that, you know, it's always a challenge sometimes. Is that a prohibited practice or not? And I think, you know, the guideline will help us to really identify the opportunity of the process, not necessarily the prohibited practices specifically. So I know this is an eye chart, but this is really the flow of things as to what happens and when. And of course, this will be available for everyone to kind of follow through and understand ultimately what happens and when. And I wanted to give a guideline, or we wanted to give kind of an idea of how things flow in the process and when things happen. There won't be a quiz on this, of course, afterwards, but if you want one, we can give you one. So who is it addressed to? Well, it's addressed to everyone. You know, the guideline is out there for anyone within the division or within the operations of what we do to report. What is the process? Of course, you know, when something is suspected or when something is identified, then there should be immediate notification, either by phone or writing. And I know we've all confronted kind of like, is that or is that not? Even if you're not sure, it should be reported.
Just to expand on that a little bit, so the guideline specifically outlines what division staff will do when a prohibited practice is suspected or discovered. However, just as a reminder, and I'm sure we're all aware, every person that's associated with our system is obligated to notify or come forward when they find things that don't look correct. So that the kind of mandated reporter aspect is universal to everyone, but the guideline specifically talks about what the division will do once something has happened. So it applies to the behavior of the division, what state staff will do when these things occur, but it also includes that piece of everybody having a stake in pointing out when somebody's rights aren't being honored or there's some sort of concerning practice happening.
Great, thanks so much, Lucas. So who is notified? Well, the supervisor, chief behavior analyst, and regional office directors. What information? Of course, it's the identifying information, the thing that the person has discovered, identifying the name of the provider, whether it's a residential provider, a day program provider, a behavior analyst, a behavior provider, or a support coordination, support coordinator identified. So those are who is informed or what information is provided. So then the next step is that the chief behavior analyst or the designee notifies the provider to cease that practice that they are engaging in, or at least to the degree that is possible while the review of that process is being done. You know, we're not going to discontinue something if there is a safety issue related to that. You know, we would be remiss in doing that. What we do need to have or ensure happens is that the provider needs to submit EMTs as reportable events as necessary daily as this prohibited practice is executed or when the prohibited practice is implemented. And everything is reported in accordance with the directive for reporting events. That's directive 4.070. And if it's not reportable, we of course need data to be taken. How frequently is this occurring? When is it occurring? So these are the next steps in the process. The next step we will do as part of the team is we have a tracker that identifies the prohibited procedures or the suspected prohibited procedures, and we will make entry into that tracker to ensure that we are extending due diligence for the review process. So here's an idea of what that tracker looks like. Of course, the name of the individual, this is all the identifying information, and then the actions that we will take. We also identify the potential type of prohibited practice or procedure it is. and the actions that will ultimately be taken to remediate it. So this tracker is used throughout the review process to ensure that all the elements of the guideline are followed through on and that we are taking the necessary actions that we need to in the process. So when do we do it? Well, we need to, once we're notified, we need to take action within 1 business day. A notice to the QE team is given, to regional office directors and to the support coordinator. A special review is scheduled, and that review entails looking at the ISPs, looking at the EMTs that are provided, looking at provider documentation, doing interviews and observations. You know, we are confronted with an interesting situation given the state of the world, that observations, we have to be a little creative in the process. Interviews we can still do via WebEx and phone calls, but some of the things we need to shift a little bit how we do things. And I know with some of the procedures now that we're involved in, we're having folks take pictures of things. We're having, looking at how we can incorporate WebExes to view things and to look at things. So the world necessitates some changes in how we do things, but we are adjusting well, I believe. So if identified by QE that a more of a review is needed, then it's done in accordance with their guideline or the guideline 54, which is the quality of services review. Also guideline 56, which is quality of services a focus review. And then in conjunction with the directive 4.080, which is the quality management framework directive. And they will help us to identify if there's an additional review required from their end as they assist us in this whole process. So the next step then is within 10 business days, we have to report on our findings. We have to report, of course, which is critical to the individual, the assistant department director, the chief behavior analyst, the regional office directors to provider relations, the guardian, the providers, and the support coordination. So once we review the materials and the information, we will then report out within 10 business days. And of course, all along, we're keeping track of things in the tracker that we've identified. So here's the secondary process of things and the review and the plan. So once a determination is made, whether it is or is not a prohibited procedure or practice, then we'll follow these chain of events to help develop a plan for the discontinuation of that prohibited procedure. And that will vary as a function of the procedure and the safest route to get to the point of discontinuing it. I'm going to pause a minute. Rod or Kay, do we have anything in the question or chats at this point?
We do, Rita. Let me get the first question. Said, what would be an example of prohibited practice that is not reportable?
That's a good question, and there's actually an example in the guideline, but I'll share it with folks right now. So a specific situation that would be prohibited, that wouldn't meet a reportable event, is when there are individualized strategies for the person that include the use of law enforcement or emergency personnel for behavioral control. So um, one of the more recent prohibited practices that have been added since Directive 4.300 and now the new behavioral support CSR is the use of law enforcement as a as needed or PRN strategy for an individualized support. So what that means is it's not a general policy of an organization to call the cops in an emergency, but it's an individualized strategy and an individualized plan to address problem behavior with cops or hospitals. So if a safety crisis plan or a behavior support plan or an ISP is discovered that has these strategies in it, that would be a prohibited practice, but it wouldn't yet meet reportable event because unless the team has actually called the cops. So if the person has a safety strategy that includes calling the cops, that's prohibited. But when they call the cops, that would be a reportable event. So that's one situation that might not be reportable if they haven't actually used the strategies yet.
And we did have a couple more questions. We had one, it says, what about incoming seeking services? New incoming applicant situation? Is this only toward active funded service delivered circumstances?
So yeah, I'm going to try to translate what I think that question means. I think that question means that if you get a new person who's just coming into funding or soon will come into funding or is funded maybe through a different mechanism, so like they are getting funding from Children's Division, but they're using one of our providers, what happens then? And so this is actually a really good question. The way that DMH works, we really only have authority over services that we pay for. So that's services that are funded through general revenue or through Medicaid waiver. So those are services that we absolutely have authority over, and this guideline applies to. However, if anybody's in our system, even if they're funded in a different way, we still have the obligation to point out and work with teams that are using things that are prohibited in our system. And so you definitely should still follow this process, even if there's a different funding stream in place that isn't DMH funded, so like Children's Division. And definitely should follow this guideline if the person's coming into our services, because at the moment we start paying for their services, then this is a problem. And so we still want to address it. The overall goal here is to help reduce and eliminate the use of these highly dangerous, highly restrictive interventions that we have assured the federal government that we will not use in our system. So it really is just best practice to be identifying these things as they come up and trying to eliminate them. So hopefully that answered the question.
And I see one more question as well, and Lori, thank you for asking. It says, will QE be notified as well of the findings?
Yes.
Of course. And I wanted to go back and add a little bit to what Lucas had mentioned. We are always working with folks from Children's Division as they bring individuals into the services that we may provide. And of course, ultimately, those individuals in Children's Division will transfer to our services fully. So we always try to work to help those teams fade those practices so that it is easier when they come into services. We also work with teams and families as individuals enter services. I know I've had some situations where the individual was coming into services and had an enclosed crib type situation. We are dealing with some situations with Children's Division where we're trying to help teams with transportation issues and individuals being supported in those situations. So we always try to extend the offer of support to those teams as they navigate through the process. So thanks, Rod, for bringing those questions to our attention.
You're welcome. There's one more. So
Okay, great.
let me put that out there. It says, I didn't realize that calling for emergency personnel support police had been added to prohibited practices. Should it be a more general statement about following agency guidelines? If the agency has a hands-off policy and calling 911 is their only viable response to dangerous problem behaviors?
No, it shouldn't be a more general statement. It already is general enough, in my opinion. And this is one of the newer additions, but it's still at least 5 years old. It's been in place since 2016. And just again, an agency should and can have a policy that they call emergency personnel in an emergency. But if you are supporting a person that needs some sort of physical crisis management or some sort of response, then that's a need that you should be addressing through strategies. And so what this prohibited practice is talking about is when you fail to plan and adequately support a person and fall back on the use of restrictive reactive strategies like law enforcement and emergency personnel when other strategies are more appropriate. So if it's a true emergency and it's never happened before, and you call the cops because that's your company policy, then that's an emergency situation that you're addressing. But when this is a repeated occurrence to the point that you have it written down that that's what you're going to do in these situations, then that becomes prohibited, because you can't have an individualized strategy for a person where you're using cops as needed behavioral support. You should have additional strategies and proactive interventions to minimize the chance we would be utilizing law enforcement or hospitals.
Great. Thanks for those additions, Lucas. And thank you, Rod, as always, for monitoring the chat box and the question. So let's continue on. So the results of the review. Once we've done our review and it's indicated that there is a prohibited practice being implemented, we refer all involved providers to provider relations. And at that point, we recommend to provider relations that a critical status plan be initiated. We also notify the TCMs and indicate that a critical status plan has been recommended. We also make entry into IQMFD, and the tracker that we've indicated before is updated. So our recommendations are to discontinue the practice immediately if possible. And again, this is a process of taking a look at the elements of which the prohibited practice is, the safety of the individual, the safety of the staff, and the elements that need to be developed to discontinue that practice. If the practice cannot be discontinued safely, then the area behavior analyst associated with that situation. And as we move to a more statewide approach, it may not necessarily be the area behavior analyst in what is considered your region, but we will try to make distribution so that everyone is supported appropriately as a team to develop a plan. So, and I'll give an example. If I have 5 prohibited practice teams on my caseload, and the Eastern region has 3 and the Central region has 2, then maybe one of the other area behavior analysts will take the lead on helping the teams as they move forward. So as we go to a more statewide approach, don't be surprised if there might be other people involved in the process. So what is our goal when we develop a plan? Well, as a team, our goal is to fade that prohibited practice as quickly and safely as possible. And I know that has been a longstanding question with teams. Oh, well, what do you mean we have to fade it? You know, do we have to do it tomorrow? There's always that concern. Oh, do we have to stop tomorrow? And, you know, the answer is no. What we do as working with the team is to evaluate the situation. We look at added supports and services for the provider and the providers, and our objective is lead to the development of positive, proactive, preventative strategies and to fade that procedure as safely as possible over time. The plan is provided monthly. So we meet monthly. We provide that information to the regional office directors, to the chief behavior analyst and provider relations. And of course, you know, we've recommended that a critical status plan be developed. So those meetings and those teams are meeting on a monthly basis. And so it may be part of the critical status plan, part of the process that we're doing together with everyone else. So all actions that are taken are entered into the tracker that we've identified previously. The TAC TCMs are provided an update. The other thing that happens is a referral is made to the Behavior Support Review Committee, and these referrals have priority over other individuals that are potentially being reviewed. So if we find that there is a prohibited procedure that a team has executed and it's part of the review process, they will be given priority in the Behavior Support Review Committee review process. In addition, if it hasn't already been done, a referral will be made to the Due Process Review Committee. So our plan, of course, at a minimum, there should be a monthly review by the team, and it may be more as deemed necessary, or there may be other elements. So there might be a monthly review with a larger team. And then in between that, there are small side meetings with the behavior analyst or with the provider or with other elements of the team. Those meetings will occur, of course, until the practice is discontinued, and reports will be made back to the regional office director, provider relations, and the TCMs if they aren't already involved in the process. Entries will also be made into IQMFD, and of course, those will be closed when the practice is discontinued, and of course, connections. Those will be, the connection system will integrate all of this, and there may be some revisions in the process and how things are updated and how the process is updated as we move forward too, as we integrate with connections. So want to extend the opportunity for any additional questions. So Rod, what do we have in the chat box there?
Well, the first question asks, how does the new incoming applicant consumer fit into this, into the reporting changes?
This is Lucas. I don't necessarily understand the question. Uh, could whoever wrote that question, could you kind of add additional context, or maybe Rita, you have some thoughts?
Well, I was thinking perhaps that this ties back to somebody coming into services and their question being, if we've got somebody who is in their natural home and they have a prohibited procedure. I know we've confronted some situations where potentially timeout was used in a home environment. And of course, timeout is no longer something that we use within the state. So, we can't continue that in our system as they acquire funding. And so maybe that's the question that they're asking.
Okay, yeah, no, that's good clarification. And so then we would just identify it at that time, and the team would work with one of the area behavior analysts and the necessary services that the person would have to safely discontinue it until it was discontinued. I would see it similar to any other situation. So at the moment that we start paying for it, it is prohibited, but that doesn't mean that, like Rita said, that we would yank a safety strategy out without a replacement. So, we would work with the team to ensure that the person could be integrated into our services in a way that's safe and successful.
Our next question, they say, you mentioned potential need to take pictures for follow-up. How is this done in a HIPAA compliant way?
Okay, well, I can use an example. We've been doing some reviews of some enclosed crib areas. So we've actually taken pictures of the beds or the enclosed cribs and shared that across, of course, with encrypted emails and information. So that's how we've done it in that procedure. Again, we're all navigating uncharted territory. So we are looking at different ways to do that. So we're not taking pictures. We haven't taken pictures of the individuals. What we've done is taken pictures of the environment. So.
Our next question says, to clarify, the law enforcement should not be part of the treatment plan?
Yes, it should not. That should not be one of the person's individualized strategies.
Okay, lots of questions, and thank you all for the questions. The next one is, will there be additional training for SCs and providers to write crisis safety plans? And most SP include calling the police.
So we can link the list of trainings that we've previously provided on safety crisis plans after folks have had a chance to review those. If there are still questions, we're happy to answer them. And yeah, we are concerned with the amount of use of law enforcement as behavioral control for folks with challenging behavior. Somebody I think mentioned earlier about law enforcement use being generally described as what you would do if you're a hands-off agency. And so one of the things that I want to challenge folks to think about is if you're an agency that's a hands-off or restraint-free agency, so that means you don't do physical crisis management, how do you determine that somebody is an appropriate fit for your organization? How do you determine that you actually can support them safely if they have a history of needing that level of response, a physical crisis response? And so what I would challenge folks to do is to think carefully about who they select to support and ensure that they actually can provide the level of support that's needed. One of the things that we know just generally is the involvement of law enforcement, specifically if they're not trained on how to interact with the folks that we support, can be tragic. And they're not necessarily the best de-escalators and responders in situations that are heightened, and we typically need more skilled folks that have knowledge about the person. The other thing that we know is we're currently still in the middle of a pandemic, and there just isn't the level of resources, which were already straining it before the pandemic, to be utilizing emergency departments and law enforcement to support folks in ways that could better be utilized with appropriate services and appropriate person-centered planning.
And to add to that, Lucas, I think we need to be mindful of the fact that, community relationships may be strained if there is an overtaxing of those emergency service personnel, which could create, additional backlash, so to speak, for our system and the individuals supported. So I think that's another element, although it isn't specific to the individual. I think it's a very important global issue to ensure that we are not overtaxing that part of the community-based resources that we have.
And I believe this is a little bit of a follow-up question to that. It said, what about the people we work for calls police all the time? How do you look or work with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so that would be a good opportunity for the team to come together and determine if there's a need for additional services. So a behavior analyst, so getting authorizations for behavior services would sound like a really good approach in that situation.
Some additional services that might be considered given that situation might be counseling too. And to determine why the person is calling emergency services. So again, I'd go for the behavior analyst and see what other additional services might be warranted.
I want to make sure I don't miss anybody here in the chat box. I see a question previously that states, who coordinates the monthly review?
Well, at this point, the associated area behavior analysts have been coordinating the meeting, so to speak. I think it's really anyone in the team can be the facilitator of that coordination once it's initially established. But of course, the responsibility for the process is with the area behavior analysts to ensure that that prohibited practice is discontinued in the long run. And I think it's a team responsibility. And anyone, Lucas, Malanta, please chime in.
Nope, you answered it perfect.
I think that's a question kind of like, who writes the safety crisis plan? The team writes the safety crisis plan. The support coordinator happens to be the person who is responsible for scribing and putting it into the ISP. So that ranks around the same one. I saw also that someone had put in the chat there, what's the CSR, and the CSR is 9 CSR 45-3.090. And if you Google it, it will come up. Wanted to remind people that, the definition or the list of prohibited procedures is in section 2 under rights of the individual and restrictive intervention. So they're all listed there. But again, that's not the be all end all. If something doesn't look right, anyone has an obligation to report it and to identify a situation. So I think that's always a critical factor, is that, well, it doesn't fit that. Well, let a team take an approach to look at it.
The next question says there are very few BCBAs in the state. What is the division doing to attempt to get more behavioral service providers, especially in rural areas?
So that's a good question, and I will talk broadly about what we've been working on for better part of a decade in the state to address the situation. So there's a couple pieces to unwrap this question. So the first one is, yep, you're right. There aren't enough behavior analysts in the state, and when we were traveling to conferences outside the state, we were actively attempting to recruit and get providers interested to come in. I've been involved in several conversations over the last couple of months with national organizations that provide behavior services to talk about potentially them coming into our state. And so we're working really hard to increase the number of providers that we have. We're also working really hard on increasing the skill of the providers that we currently have through things like the Behavior Support Review Committee, through our Growing Together and professional learning communities to try to help behavior analysts be more confident in leveraging their skills to support people with challenging behaviors. The other thing that we're working really hard on is trying to help build proactive and preventative supports across the state so that people don't get to the point where they end up in the hospital or end up in jail or end up with the cops being called. And that includes our efforts to work with agencies to become tiered supports agencies. It also includes helping teams do better planning at the beginning so that we can kind of get ahead of some of this stuff that can be foreseen, which also includes when people move. So one of the things that we have noticed, and I'm sure you all are aware of, is sometimes people move to places that don't have a lot of supports. And so one of the things, again, challenging all of us on this call to think about is that the right move for the person? Just because there's a provider that has a bed in a remote location, is that the best place for a person to move when they don't have the subsequent services that that person definitely needs, including behavior services? So again, there's no one simple fix for this problem. There's no magic pill. There's no silver bullet, so to speak, to kind of slay this monster. It's a lot of little things that we're doing, and it's trying to partner better with teams to do better planning up front to avoid some of these things that are easily foreseeable and easier to avoid if we do planning up front. So that's really, I think, the crux of it.
You know, Lucas, there are a couple other things I think that we are trying to do, and some of that is we are trying to supervise up and coming BCBAs in the process. We are also partnering with our state operated programs, BCBAs, to also work together with them to develop behavior analysts. As you said, some of those positive, proactive, preventative strategies, of course, we have the Provider Support Committee, which is a rich avenue for learning and developing of providers and skills, and also for sharing of resources. That they had a really awesome presentation this last time, or one of the last times, about remote supports and looking at resources we don't often use as readily, and taking advantage of those tiered supports elements that we have, the positive support consultants, and as we develop that second tier, those risk prevention consultants. So I think, you know, like you said, many moving parts, not only to address the needs for BCBAs, but also to address the needs of the entire system that really needs that continuum of supports. Right, Rod, are there any other questions in the chat box that we perhaps overlooked or need to address?
I do not see any other questions. However, I did put the link to the Tiered Supports website in the chat box for everyone.
Great. And Kay, I believe you were going to also put in the chat for everyone the links to the guidelines and the CSR so that everyone has that.
Correct. Correct. They're in there twice.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Kay.
I've also added several other links as we've been talking today. So I've added ABA services link. I've added behavior services link of information, safety crisis plan and question and answer session. It's a YouTube webinar presentation that was recorded that I added in there. So there's a variety of links in the chat box for everyone to check and look at. I added just the regular safety crisis plan link that is from these are all from the DMH website. They're nothing I created. They're out there for everyone to look at and everyone to view and to learn from. And if anyone needs any additional supports, please contact someone on this committee or someone else at the regional office level that can support you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kay, for putting all those links in there. Those are critical elements of training that are actually already available. And as Kay said, if, once you've gone through those, that there are still questions, please reach out to us. Your positive support consultants, your risk prevention consultants, or the intensive systems consultants or area behavior analysts. Going to reach out to my associates to check to see if you folks have anything else you'd like to add to the information that we've presented this morning. Melantha.
Anything else, Rita? Thank you for asking.
Lucas?
Thank you, Rita. Just to circle back to what I want, though, hopefully the main takeaway here for folks is that the division has a standard process that's in writing now on what we're going to do in these situations. It really is the process that we've been doing for 6 years or more at this point, but now it's in writing so people can have a set sense of kind of what to expect. And in no situation would we yank needed supports away. We would work with the team to reduce things safely, understanding that there are certain practices that are prohibited and have to be discontinued eventually, but we have a long history of working closely with teams to do this safely and successfully, and so we're going to continue to do that. So those are the major takeaways that hopefully people will get from this.
Lucas, you bring up an amazing point, is that we will take the time to work with teams to safely fade those procedures over time. I know in situations I've been involved with, we've taken anywhere up to 2 or 3 years to safely fade things. And I know Melantha has worked effectively with teams to fade procedures, and so has Lucas. So it's not a matter of, oh, you have to take that away tomorrow. The idea is that we get things in place, we let the data lead us, and we do this safely and successfully for everyone.
I'm sorry, but Kay, can you put those links back in the chat? Myself and Rod don't see them either. They're not showing up in the chat.
Sure, not a problem. I put them to all attendees. Is that how I should do it?
It should be put to, yes, everyone. But for some reason, they're not showing up, and Rod looked as well.
I think that just the team can't see them. I'm getting other reports that everybody else sees them.
Oh, okay. Well, that's what matters.
Phew. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have for this morning. I want to thank the my associates for all the input and all the sharing that we've done this morning. And thank you for all of those who attended. And again, this will be recorded and available for everyone to review when they have maybe a lot of information presented this morning. You may need some time to digest, and if there are any additional questions, we of course will develop that Q&A process, and we might even initiate an additional Q&A opportunity once people have some time to really integrate this information into their repertoire. So I have nothing else for this morning, so I want to thank everyone and have a great day.